I speak to you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You know, after a lifetime of spiritual experience, St. Paul wrote these words: I don't want you to be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. My wife and I pulled up in a parking lot in the Redwood Forest near Oakland. We were there to perform a native wedding. It was a misty rain as we walked along the path beside the tall redwoods. We didn't know quite what to expect, as the bride was a Mormon and the groom was a Native American. Wonderful smell of scented wood smoke greeted our nostrils as we neared the place where we were to celebrate the wedding. The smoke called to us. It was the smell of cedar boughs placed on a large central fire. You see, there were 3 fires, one for the bride, one for the groom, and then the home fire. And the groom appeared, naked to the waist, with a deerskin on his head and around his waist, his face with black ceremonial marks on it. The bride was all in white, her blonde hair a sharp contrast to the shock of black hair of her groom. Then it happened. The groom went away from the home fire and sat down on a log. And a most heartfelt cry came out of him, almost a wailing sound, as he called up the spirit of the mountain to bless him and his new bride. I wondered as I listened to it just how long it had been since the spirit of the mountain had been called upon. This heart-wrenching cry came out of the groom from the depths of his soul. I'd never heard anything like it, but I decided it had to be a kind of prayer. It wasn't long before the forest rangers came along and told the groom he had to put the fires out. They said they were only allowed in the fire pits, provided. I thought to myself, this doesn't look good. It's going to lose this one on his wedding day. And the groom drew them aside, and then he got down on one knee and pleaded with them, saying that these woods had once belonged to his forgotten people. Could they make an exception, just this once, on his wedding day, and look the other way? Well, perhaps the spirit of the mountain heard him, for soon the rangers were on their way, telling the groom that they would pick up the straw that he had brought for a ceremonial bed for the forest floor, if the groom would rake it all up into one place afterwards. So the groom got his wedding in all its ceremonial beauty. Was this the power of prayer? C.S. Lewis writes about a woman diagnosed with cancer. He said, I've stood beside the bedside of a woman whose thigh bone was eaten out with cancer, and who had thriving colonies of the disease in many other bones as well. It took 3 people to move her in the bed. Doctors predicted a few months of life, the nurses, who often know better, a few weeks. A good man laid his hands upon her and prayed. A year later, the patient was walking uphill too, through rough woodland, and the man who took the last x-ray photos was saying, these bones are as solid as rock. It's miraculous. Now, Lewis, a devout apologist to the faith, did, however, not conclude that this means that prayer always works. In fact, he argues that prayer is not testable like a scientific experiment. It reminds us that prayer is always a request, as St. Paul said. Make your requests known unto the Lord. Prayer is not some kind of magic. If it's a request, then sometimes the answer will be no, or not yet, or yes, but there'll be nothing automatic about it. True story. A transport collided with a BMW. The transport driver went right off the bridge and plunged 100 feet to his death in a fiery wreck. The mangled BMW dangled off the bridge with a mother and 2 children in the wreck. By an incredible coincidence, stuck in traffic, close to them was a Navy SEAL's truck, the only available vehicle to save the car from going over the bridge due to its immense lifting capacity. And so it was deployed, and the woman and her children were eventually cut free from the wreckage and taken with major injuries to the hospital where they survived. Immediately, in the paper and on the blogs, the coincidence of the Navy SEALs was seen as an act of God. Just as immediately, scorn was put upon that theory because the truck driver died a horrible death in the truck. For religious people, the question became, why did God save the woman and her children and let that trucker die? Was it because the woman prayed for help and perhaps the trucker did not? What kind of a God would operate like that? Lewis argues the question then arises, what sort of evidence would prove the efficacy of prayer? The thing we pray for may happen, but how can you ever know it's not going to happen anyway? Even if the thing were indisputably miraculous, it would not follow that the miracle had occurred because of your prayers. The answer surely is that compulsive, empirical proof, such as we have in the sciences, can never be attained, unquote. You know, this is very wise advice given by Lewis. It would save a lot of controversy if it was followed. But does it mean that we're not to pray for any kind of an outcome? When someone we love is dying, are we not to pray for them because the person in the bed beside them died yesterday? When a friend's in trouble with their marriage, do we not pray for them because a lot of people get divorced? Lewis argues that Blaise Pascal thought that we were given by God 2 kinds of dignity. One, we could work to make things happen ourselves, or 2, we could ask for divine help. Prayer was, however, a higher causality, and unlike our work, the outcome was not under our control. Now, this twofold mission of work and prayer, Pascal called the dignity of causality, which identifies that we are different from the rest of the creation we believe. And Lewis argued that the higher causality of prayer is request only. As Lewis says, an infinitely wise being listens to the requests of finite and foolish creatures. Of course, he's sometimes going to grant and sometimes refuse them. Invariably, success in prayer would prove something much more like magic, a power in certain human beings to control or compel the course of nature. Jesus in the New Testament says of this higher causality, whatsoever things you ask for in prayer, believe that you have them already, and they shall be yours. Jesus is asking us to vision an outcome, to engage spiritual power on our behalf in the present moment. It's like putting the clutch in a gear shift car. It's all we can do. The power is not ours to command. We have no idea whether the car is going to move or not. Also in the New Testament, Jesus asks 3 times in prayer before his death to have his own cup of suffering removed. 3 times the request is denied, and he goes to his cross. On the cross he cries out, "Why have you forsaken me?" If God exists, as people of faith believe, then some requests are denied, even to the stature of someone like Jesus. Now, this has been my experience over these many years. I've prayed for people in hospital when there was literally no hope, and I've seen them discharged the following day. I prayed for a man who was brain dead on the respirator, Bob Cochran, saw him restored to his family. I've prayed for a man who had a stroke. He was the father of my real estate lady, and seen the stroke lift and the swallow reflex restored so he could eat again. I have also prayed and received many no's. For me, when to pray for physical healing and when not is important. To guide us, we've been given intuition, what we call our gut feelings, and it's always wise to consult our inner wisdom as to how we should pray. See, this inner wisdom is not infallible, though, but over the years I've found it to be quite a good guide. When we're praying for others, what does our gut say to us about outcome? See, in prayer, there's a lot going on. Positive thinking changes outcomes. It also will boost your immune system. Will to live does as well. Love is a healer as well. The power of intention changes outcomes. There are mysterious forces that are often in play beside the beds of the sick. Often there's a soul sickness behind the body sickness, and a healing of the soul or psyche may lead to a healing of the body. Prayer for me is sacred, personal, and no barriers. I feel totally accepted by God when I pray. I've experienced a deep comfort in times of tragedy. I've experienced physical healing from prayer. I've known an amazing recovery several times in my life. I believe that all of us who are open to God can respectfully request God's protection and guidance. I often feel direction from God and sense that I'm exactly where I should be at this time in my life, which is why I'm here at Knox at this moment. And that's a wonderful, heartfelt kind of feeling to experience. Also, in times of trouble, I felt a great someone that I could turn to. In life, in death, in pleasure, in pain, in joy, or in sorrow, I believe that God has been there for David Thompson. I know this in my gut, and I am very, very thankful. But someone said to me recently, whatever would we do, David, if we couldn't pray? It's a good question. There are, however, some questions I can't answer. How can a loving God permit the Holocaust in Nazi Germany at the end of the Second World War? There's a Jewish play which has been written which puts God on trial for what happened in the Holocaust, and God is found guilty. How do we explain the tragedy of 9/11? How do we explain what happened with COVID? I was talking to a woman yesterday who lost her husband to COVID. How do we explain the death and destruction in Ukraine or in Gaza? What do we do when person after person that we know passes away? That is so hard. Sure, we can know about the inhumanity of human beings towards one another in the Nazi death camps and the Twin Towers and the war in Ukraine and the destruction of Gaza and the Hamas actions in Israel. But what about trying to answer why all this stuff happens? So many innocent people have died. My tentative answers are that we as human beings have an awesome kind of freedom. And that freedom has got consequences, including our own death and that of the death of others. You see, we can be loving to one another or cruel beyond thought. We're that free. And we get the consequences of our ability to cause things to happen here on earth. We all die. Some live to old age. Some live and survive tragedies. The woman and the children on the bridge dangling in her car over the edge survived, but the trucker did not. One thing I know from hundreds of stories from people who have been resuscitated in intensive care units, they lose all fear of death. They're met by those who have gone before. They know that we don't die alone. That trucker would have been met. It was his time. And for all of us, there's the provision that life goes on after death. It comforts me that our great faith teaches us that once we pass from this side of death to the other side, we're absent from the body and present with God. And I believe that with all my heart. I don't think anyone dies alone. I think God is always there. David White tells an amazing story about prayer that took place in the Galapagos Islands. He writes, "The backdrop of the story is dramatic. It's an amphitheater of rock and sea and a wild, lonely, wave-drenched hunk of rock." He says, imagine the air filled with cries of seabirds and sea lions, and imagine you hear every so often a huge roaring sound from below the cliff, where the waves tear up through a deep crack in the living rock. It was in this place that he came to lead Matt Downing, a fellow naturalist, into a near-death experience. He says, Matt and I were on the top of the cliff, staring at the vast sea that stretches all the way to the Antarctic ice shelf. At one point, beneath that cliff, lay a large platform of lava rock. A ramp in the cliff led down onto that platform and to the source of the roaring sound. A huge curving crack snaked in from the edge of the cliff for 20 feet. Beneath this, the full fury of the ocean would concentrate before spraying up through this opening. The whole effect was like the famous geyser Old Faithful. As a guide, he says, I would stand near the edge of the crack and take a saltwater shower under the falling plume while the tour group clicked merrily away, capturing a moment for their slideshows. I'd done this for months, and I was sure it had helped increase the generosity of the group when at journey's end, they held a collection for the guide's most deserving tip. In this spirit, he persuaded Matt to join him at the edge of the blowhole. He was a little hesitant, but soon joined in the exhilaration of being showered by tons of water falling on us from a great height. I remember seeing the photographs many weeks later, taken by our watching group one moment before disaster struck. There we were, having all the fun in the world, but beneath us, off camera, the water suddenly disappeared. We waited for it to surge back. It did not. Something was wrong. I looked down to the sea below, and the ocean was curling into the most frightful, pent-up tsunami. I grabbed Matt's arm, shouted, God Almighty! We barely had time to turn away when the mighty surge barreled back up the crack, and that was overtaken by this huge wave rolling right over the top of the cliff. He remembered trying to keep his feet in front of him because there was a 12-foot rock step in the platform against which we were going to be flung, he says. I didn't want to hit it head first. My arm had been loosed from Matt's, and he disappeared into the surging nothingness. I hit the lava wall feet first, and then I was dragged back by the force of the ebbing water over the platform to the very edge of the cliff. The next image offered to the eyes of our group was me gripping the edge of the blowhole, my feet hanging into its mouth. Beyond me, Matt hung off the edge of the cliff, his feet swinging wildly for purchase. The next wave hit us like a hammer blow. This time, there was no keeping my feet in any direction. I was somersaulted over the step, over and over. The second wave was so huge, it took me right over the top of the lava step. I surged forward, banging against the rocks until I reached the awestruck group and was left at their feet, lacerated and shocked. He says, I remember looking up into the horrified faces and thinking in an abstract way that this performance should merit a very big tip. The thought crumpled immediately in the shock and realization of his banged-up state. He says, I was also desperate for the sight of Matt. There he lay about 30 feet away, blood running down his back and arms. Matt was evacuated to the boat, deliriously asking if anyone had got the number of the truck that had hit him, while I recovered lying flat out on the beach, amazed I wasn't dead. The blessing, he said, was in sheer survival. A few feet here, a few feet there, and I would have been over that cliff from whence there was no return. A boat couldn't even approach to pick up the body. He says, I've been given the sight of my own end, and he returned to carry that revelation into the rest of his existence. He says, you know, I was not a discreet sports star in the firmament of my own adulation. I belonged, he said, instead to a very powerful world. Everything had its own life, equal to my own. Still, in an ironic kind of way, I felt I'd come to all this myself. I'd survived under my own luck and power. As waves recede in my memory, he says, I come 3 years later to the armchair in Yorkshire and my mother sipping a glass of whiskey. I was home for only a short stay, and we were talking about my travels and the amount of time I spent away from her. In inimitable Irish fashion, my mother was telling me how much she missed me and how she said a prayer for my safety every night. I nodded in good sunlight fashion, was ready to move on to more adult things appropriate to a grown man talking to his mother. But before I could encourage the conversation onto other ground, she began to tell me about a vivid dream that had woken her up during my time in the Galapagos. Apparently in the dream, I had been standing on a black cliff with another person next to a fountain of water. A huge, frightening wave bore down on us in the dream. It's the blowhole on Hood Island, he immediately thought, and the hair began to stand up on the back of his neck as she spoke, describing in clear detail from her dream the exact circumstance of my near drowning. This is a woman thousands of miles away. You know, he said, I've never breathed so much as a word of the incident, knowing how much she worried about me, nor had I told my father or either of my sisters. She said, you were standing on a cliff edge next to the strange fountain when a big wave came over the top and swept you away. You came floating back in all the turmoil, and then another bigger wave came and you were being taken out to sea. She says, I felt the blackness of the water waiting for you. In the dream, I leaned down from above, took hold of you by the back of the neck, I lifted you up and put you safely on the cliff, and when I woke, I felt so happy I'd been able to save you. Love lifted me. Did you see this coincidence? It's not an accident, this stuff. Sorry to be so passionate, but that's the way it is. David looked at his mother with absolutely amazing excitement. He said, you know, I was shocked into silence to hear such a prescribed, accurate description of something so private to me. He'd been trying to forget it. The sound of the waves seemed to surround her as she spoke. He looked at her as if he'd seen a ghost, which he had. It was his own self-image vanishing. He said, we stared into our glasses and looked at each other, and then he found amidst himself all the other waves. Waves of laughter at the absurdity of it all. They began to ripple to the surface, and my mother began to laugh too. Isn't it a marvelous, I said, here I am adventuring around the world in some invulnerable version of Indiana Jones, Lord of all I survey, and all the time it's my mother coming in like the cavalry, and at the end saving me from the jaws of destruction. He raised her glasses together, hooting at the image, but as the laughter subsided, he told himself in no uncertain terms, David, whatever it is you think you are, give it up. There are powers in the world about which you know very little. Like, for instance, the little woman sitting in front of you, who sponsored your exclusive membership in this hard-to-obtain world, and for all you know, still pays a hefty part of your annual dues. There was a feeling in that room of time stopping still. He said, I'm not interested in the psychic glamour of it all, nor the intuitive reach of my mother, which I'd experienced many times before. Yes, I was perfectly prepared to believe that her prayerful intercession was real, that without her watchful, loving presence, he would have been swept away. Now from me. No, still from him. Whatever powers we have in the world, in our work, in our leadership, in our imaginations, they're in the gift of a much larger world than the one we have made for ourselves. We're dependent in all our lives on a deeper, wider creation which we must join. a creation waiting to transform us in that joining by the merest touch. Now for me, there's more to this universe than you and I know. Miracles do happen. Strange things occur. They're not under our control. They may or may not make sense. Like those Navy SEALs who are in the right place at the right time with exactly the right equipment. Should we not celebrate their competence and ability because the truck driver died? Should we not give thanks to God for the deliverance for that woman and her children? Should we not honor an Irish mother's prayer for a son in the Galapagos Islands? Because we don't know everything, I've come to think that humility is an appropriate response, as well as gratitude every time someone survives miraculously. As Shakespeare said in his play Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy.